All right, we're still in the same kind of general geographic region. We're in this kind of little concentrated area around Paris. And Chartres Cathedral, will say for dating here, this is complicated. So be approximate with dates, because the original cathedral of Chartres was built before Notre Dame in Paris, but then it was destroyed by a fire and it was rebuilt after 1194 and consecrated in 1260. These earlier dates, don't worry about it. They have an important relic here. They possess the tunic that Mary wore at the Nativity. This is a hugely important relic in this time of intense Marian devotion. And another important thing to note about Chartres is that this is the first Gothic church to have been planned with flying buttresses from the beginning. So the entire kind of Gothic structure was conceived of at once. Let's look at the west facade here, the west end. We see lots of opportunities for sculpture in the portals. We have the tracery here, this delicate stone framing of the rose window, massive stained glass lancet windows, and then these two soaring towers. This is another portal. This is actually on the west facade. This is the middle portal of the west facade here. And we can see that, so this is the portal that that royalty would have used. And we see different images of Christ. In the center, of course, this middle tympanum panel, we have Christ in majesty. On the right, we have Christ enthroned. And here we have a kind of virgin and child image. And if we just take a look at this central panel and compare it to an earlier a Romanesque portal, we can see that that the sculpture is more condensed. We have more of it in the entrance portal itself. We can see it is more three-dimensional, and every possible space is now being used for sculpted figures. All right, here we are in the interior. That, let me see, do I have the, no, of course I don't have the interior with the plan. Let's go back here to the plan, and you can see that this is a completely reorganized space. We have a full semicircle in the east end, and a much more unified feeling between the transept arms, the east choir, the ambulatory, the radiating chapels. We also get this feeling of light and airiness. The masonry feels lighter, and of course that is because of the flying buttresses on the exterior that allow for higher, wider, bigger vaults and all of this stained glass. This is really part of the entire Gothic building system, using ribbed groin vaults, slightly pointed arches that we see throughout the design, and then the huge infusion of windows. So if we think about that elevation, the main aisle, the gallery, and the clerestory, look at how big the clerestory has become. We see two lancet windows and a mini rose window on top. That's really giving that emphasis here on the verticality, looking up, we're drawn up, and that inclusion of stained glass, it creates this kind of otherworldly light, this kind of miraculous feeling. And what's special about Chartres is that a lot of its stained glass survives, which is often unusual. And here we see a mid-12th century example of a window from Chartres. Almost this entire Gothic stained glass window series has survived, and this is the Tree of Jesse, which is essentially the family tree of Christ. And so we see Christ sitting at the top here, and we have all of these subsequent generations of his ancestry, tracing them back to his Old Testament predecessors. Again, here, just looking at some of these other windows, the scenes from the life of Christ. So here's a nativity scene. Here's that Tree of Jesse window. Other vignettes from the life of Christ. Now, sometimes people talk about, oh, Gothic stained glass windows. This was so important because not everybody was literate, and so these were educational tools. I would push back on that line of thinking a little bit, because if you've ever been to a Gothic cathedral, you know that standing from one point of view down on the floor, it's hard to see all of this. I'm the nerd who always brings binoculars when I go to a church, and even with binoculars, it's hard. And I also think that these windows are so complex. Something like the Tree of Jesse, this requires a lot of theological kind of base knowledge to understand what's being produced or what's being depicted here. And so we shouldn't think of this as a kind of educational tool for the illiterate. This is still meant for an educated intellectual viewer. All right, here's Notre Dame in Paris. And here the abbot is Maurice Dussali, who is another, like Suger, famous teacher and preacher. And, you know, he had a little bit of a competition with Suger. So Suger is this amazing rags to riches story. He was the son of a peasant, got to go have this elite education at Saint-Denis. Same with Abbot Maurice. He comes from very humble backgrounds and is educated in Paris and kind of wants to outdo his rival Suger. This is the largest of this early generation of Gothic cathedrals. It is 400 feet long and 108 feet tall. And if we look at the plan here above, it is complex. We see double aisles from the west end to the ambulatory. In fact, we have this double ambulatory here. And we see the classic three-story elevation, the kind of nave arcade, the gallery, and then the clerestory. Again, really reaching here. Let's, for comparison's sake, think about Notre Dame next to a Romanesque cathedral, the Cathedral of Santiago de Compostela. The goal here of the Camino de Santiago, the long pilgrimage route. We can look here at these interiors. Let's go there first. We see this kind of low, heavy masonry of this simple barrel vault. Now, much more complex with these ribbed groin vaults. We really have a two-part nave elevation here, the arcade and the gallery. That's now three-part with the emphasis on the clerestory. And all of that masonry has been lightened up. Let's look at the plans. In Santiago here, we see a kind of piecemeal design. All of these different, kind of separate individual areas. The transept arms, the aisles, the ambulatory, the side chapels. At Notre Dame, we see one seamless, unified space. In fact, the transept arms aren't really arms that stick out from the nave body at all. Okay, let's move to Laon. Before we think about, before the end of this video, I'll save the final video here for thinking about early Gothic outside of France. So, Laon was, again, we're in northern France on the trading road between Paris and Flanders. And this is an example of a kind of boom town, a late medieval boom town, where the bishop wants to rebuild the cathedral, but of course he needed the support and he needed the financial donation of the townspeople. And in fact, here in Laon, the townspeople and bishop were in constant conflict. Construction was consistently slowed by violent uprisings. And the towers that we see here weren't added until the 13th century. Think about other major building projects in cities, in college campuses. they rarely are met with universal support because of the financial implications. This is expensive stuff, and when the bishop is constantly squeezing you for a donation, you might get sick and tired of that. I think one comparison is maybe to the campus stadium at CSU, where that was a huge expenditure for the university, and it actually, and we see tuition increase by, oh gosh, what was it, like 7 or 8% during the construction of the stadium. All right, one of my favorite elements here, and I think we can see it best here on the facade. Do you see these little heads peeking out of the Westwork towers? Those are oxen. And I just think that's so fascinating because, of course, oxen were important workers at any sort of building site in the Middle Ages. They were beasts of burden, hauling stone, hauling the wooden scaffolding material. And here we have, in all of these different little kind of tracery openings, we see full life-size oxen peeking out as a kind of tribute to their contribution. And just looking at the facades of Paris and Lens side by side, you know, we see in Paris the facade is much more compact and more enclosed, whereas Lens has this kind of more dynamic, interpenetrating forms of the towers, the turrets, the deep porches. Look at how deeply set those entrance portals are, or the windows that are set into arches. It's a much more there's a much more kind of sculpted dynamism of mass and void in this work. And just to end on this comparison here, we have not yet looked at Amiens, but if we look at Lens, Paris, and Chartres side by side here, I love these comparisons where we have the three basic components of the elevations, but we see them in different proportions, and we see here too this real drive to create something that's taller, more spectacular, with the goal of transporting the viewer to a higher plane, to connect on a personal level with the divine.